So, although you had given me the topic confined to testing antibiotic susceptibility and antibiotic resistance in India, I thought for this audience it may be good to talk a little bit about the basic microbiology also. So, I have added that, and I hope you find it appropriate.
Yes, ma'am. Please go.
So, let me say that any infection, like ocular infection, is no different than many other infections, which the diagnosis actually begins in the clinic. And you make an impression by seeing the patient, and then you would like to send a sample to the microbiologist to confirm or deny your clinical impression. So the first thing we like to do is a direct observation of the sample, and then we try to culture the organism, because in direct observation you may see very few organisms and you may miss that. A culture will give a chance for the organism to multiply and show its presence, as well as by culture we can get the viable organism and do further testing. And now, of course, everybody knows that molecular tests are available to find the DNA of the organism. So, in case you are or situations where you are unable to culture, you might be able to get the diagnosis by doing the molecular tests. So, the etiological agents of eye infections are similar to other infections. It's a large variety consisting of bacteria, fungus, virus, parasites, everything. There is no group of organisms which don't affect the eye. Everything can affect. Therefore, as a microbiologist, we don't miss anything working on any of the types of organisms. I am a firm believer in direct microscopy, because that's the only one which is very quick and very rewarding. And over the years, I have learned the significance of this, because by direct observation, direct microscopy, we can help the patient, the clinician, the best. Instead of waiting for culture and then trying to do tests, molecular tests, and give the diagnosis tomorrow, day after, or after that, it doesn't really make much sense as far as management of the patient is concerned. So here is an example. I have several examples, but this is one of the recent ones, where the patient had already 2 months history of redness, watering, pain, and reduced vision, and had a history of fall of unknown foreign body, was put up on topical steroids by another doctor previously before coming to us, and that was for 2 weeks. And elsewhere was also diagnosed as fungal keratitis, and history or the papers showed that he has had Ta, BCL, AC reformation. 1 month was natamycin. So you can see a lot of things had already happened to the patient, and came with a very poor vision of PLPR inaccurate and real thinning of the cornea. And when we made a scraping from the cornea, and we looked at the calcofluor, you can see lots of filaments here, fungal. Can you see my cursor?
Yes,
Yes,
ma'am.
madam.
Continue,
Yes,
cursor.
The
yes.
arrow when I show, yeah. So you have in this calcofluor white preparation under the microscope large number of septate fungal filaments, and the diagnosis is almost confirmed that it is a fungal keratitis. So the earlier diagnosis was not wrong, although the patients were treated with a variety of drugs. But what made me really jump with the excitement was when I saw the gram stain. So I'll be showing you in next slides that we do both the stains. We do KOH with calcofluor white, and we do a gram stain with the cornea scraping. And in the gram stain, I saw only gram positive cocci, which is suggestive of staphylococcus. And I got worried that am I seeing this scraping is mixed up, maybe some other patient's slide, because there were no fungal filaments here. And so I kept on searching, and then I found another field where both were there. The fungus was there. You can see very nice septate filaments and lots of gram-positive cocci, uh, almost like a culture smear. It is full. So it's very clear. Within 1 hour we do these examinations, and we know that we are dealing with a mixed infection, this patient, and that is why patient was not responding and went on worsening. So this is the benefit of doing a direct microscopy as early as possible in the event of a patient being seen in the OPD. Another very rewarding things we have had by way of direct observation is the finding of microsporidial keratoconjunctivitis and microsporidial, you can see stromal also. So we have published lots of papers. I've lost count, maybe more than a dozen papers on microsporidial infections of the eye. And the diagnosis is only in direct microscopy. There is no other way because the organism doesn't grow in culture. So every case that we have diagnosed so far of microsporidial keratitis or keratoconjunctivitis, we have been able to catch the diagnosis based on direct microscopy of the corneal scrapings. And here you have the clinical picture of keratoconjunctivitis. Even the tarsal conjunctiva is involved. Follicular conjunctivitis you get, and these very beautiful spores, unmistakable. If you see in calcofluoride, you cannot mistake them, you cannot miss them, because usually they are in very large number. And here it is in gram stain. Gram stain, if a person has not seen earlier, may think it's a gram negative or gram positive cocci or bacilli, but there is a distinct difference. Once you have seen it, you will understand that it is not like bacteria. And also similarly, Pythium, Samrat mentioned about my recent obsession with the Pythium, which actually I'll tell you later how we first got the diagnosis, but now we are able to do direct microscopy and look at aseptate broad filaments, which are different than normal fungal filaments we see with the septate and stout features. So there is a distinct difference in direct microscopy, and only when we are able to recognize in the initial cornea scraping, it's going to help the patient, because the treatment of Pythium keratitis is with antibiotics and not natamycin. So with this, I go to the next slide to show you that these are some of the minimum things required in a very small laboratory by which you can at least catch the diagnosis of the diseases I just mentioned. You will definitely be able to see the fungal filaments, Pythium filaments, microsporidia, and other bacteria also. One needs to be familiar with the size of the organisms to be able to really identify what you are seeing, to have a perspective. So this is just to show you that Staphylococcus looks like a dot. You saw in the other picture I showed you, just like a dot it looks. And that is at the magnification of 100x. That is oil emulsion, which gives a magnification of 1,000 times. So you cannot see a dot like that in low power and say that this is Staphylococcus. You need to have a perspective of the size. Fungal filaments similarly are at least 2 micron wide, and they will look different sizes in low power and high power, and then in 100. So when you look at a smear at high power and then look at a gram stain, normally KOH we look at 10x or 40x, which gives you 100x and 100 times magnification and 400 times. Whereas the same fungus will look much broader in the 1000x. So these are the sizes. RBC size, you might remember how wide it is, just 7 micron in size. So gram stain is very easily available in the market, and I'm sure in your laboratory I know that it is being done from the beginning. So it's advisable for the fellows to go and have a look how it is done and how you see the organisms. You can see gram-positive cocci, gram-negative bacilli very easily. Similarly, acid-fast stains are available in the market, and you can do 20% acid-fast, which gives mycobacteria, and 1% acid-fast, which shows you nocardia. This is a very, Samrat, do you have a fluorescent microscope by now?
Not yet, ma'am. Not yet.
Okay, but it's very useful. I think your hospital is old enough to now actually acquire this. It improves the diagnosis very, very many-fold actually.
Yes,
So
ma'am.
you can
Agree with
see
that.
the fungal filaments so clearly, so beautifully. Acanthamoeba, you can see, and it is much. People don't miss that because the color is very bright and it shows very quickly. So addition of calcofluoride to the KOH, it really improves the diagnosis. So if possible, you should be getting that. And of course, there are other methods nowadays. Recently, one of our colleagues from Bhubaneswar, she added what is called iodine staining of the corneal scrapings. She did in histopathology samples also, and it gives a blue color for pythium. It is very, very specific for pythium. She's published that in Cornea. And if one can do that, so in addition to calcofluoride, where you can see aseptate filaments of the broad aseptate filaments of pythium, and at the same time they are in this staining, iodine potassium iodide staining, they are blue in color because of the cellulose. They don't have ergosterol in their cell wall. That's a difference from fungus. This is from her publication. You can see the blue color is very clear, and this is a normal aspergillus or fusarium fungus, and these are the pythium which are blue in color. We are aware when you read Western literature that majority of their infections are bacterial, and so many of them don't really go to microbiology investigation of especially corneal ulcers. Because they believe they can treat with fluoroquinolones broad spectrum and it'll take care of all corneal ulcers. But when you look at the global prevalence of bacterial and fungal keratitis, you can see that so many countries have fungal so high in prevalence that we cannot really treat every patient as bacterial just with fluoroquinolones. So we have to, even if it is a very small setup like our secondary centers, in 20 centers we have in different states, including Andhra, Telangana, and in Orissa as well as in Karnataka, we have one secondary center. Every center we have placed a microscope and have given the facility to do at least KOH and gram staining. And this is the picture of KOH, which actually trained eyes or eyes which have seen many, many smears can actually distinguish. This is septate filaments, and these are acanthamoeba cis, and you can see very fine nocardia filaments as well as microsporidia. When I had gone to Bhubaneswar, I worked there for 6-7 years, and we published the first paper on microsporidia. I had seen everything under only KOH. You can see they are very clear actually. Are usually clear because they are in clumps. It's an intracellular organism. It grows inside the cell, so it remains in clumps, and you can see them clearly. Gram stain is a good stain, but it has many, many artifacts one has to get used to. Otherwise, you can see every type of organism there. So a gram stain is not specific only for bacteria. You can see fungus, you can see acanthamoeba, you can see microsporidia. Uh, so all types of organisms can be seen, and it is good to have two stains. You see something in KOH, and then it should also be there in gram stain for you to confirm. Other stains we have not used much, but there are publications, and now we are just evaluating trypan blue. Trypan blue is a stain which you are using for capsulorhexis in cataract surgery, and the leftover stains are usually thrown away. Now we are evaluating, and there is one publication in Cornea recent, though that publication doesn't give full details, but it gives the idea that one can use this trypan blue. And currently we are evaluating, and hopefully soon we'll be able to compare that with other stains and come out with our results. This is to show you the nocardia I already mentioned. Acid fast, 1% acid is used for this, and this is mycobacteria. One clue we get in gram stain that mycobacteria might be present is very faintly stained or unstained bacilli, which when the same slide can be stained with acid fast stain, and we can see the acid fast bacilli here. This is the same gram stain, so you don't really need to go to the patient and take another scraping. If you suspect in the gram stain unstained bacilli or partially stained gram positive bacilli, decolorize this slide and do the acid fast staining, and you'll be able to see. Normally we see very huge in our laboratory. We actually go to the clinic and take the samples. They are taken at the side of the patient and inoculated into various, first we take on the slides, 2 slides, and then we go to the culture media. Directly we inoculate. You can take a number of media based on the number of scrapings that you'll be able to take from a case. And for vitreous, those who are uh, dealing with patients with endophthalmitis, we actually get the sample in the syringe, and in the laboratory it is directly placed on plates, drop wise. We don't have to use a loop for spreading it because we don't expect a huge number of organisms, and spreading can lead to some kind of a contamination also. We just avoid that by putting drops, because we have to look at where the colonies are growing. It must grow within the drop. So we don't like to spread that. And I'm not sure, you may not be having a blood culture, but in general hospitals, they also have a facility of blood culture systems. Nowadays, you get very good automated methods of blood culture. And what we have realized that if you put few drops of vitreous inside the blood culture bottle and put in this machine, the sensitivity is much higher. Even if the vitreous doesn't grow anything in usual blood agar and chocolate agar, sometimes we are finding that this blood culture bottle picks up the growth. So if the facility is available, and those who get a chance to work in a general hospital where the microbiology lab might be having a blood culture setup, they can use this facility. Other samples that we can get in the laboratory may require, for example, after you do keratoplasty, the tissue, sometimes bandage contact lens, then you have other types of samples. You can cut into pieces and put into different types of media for growth. And not just, suppose you're getting one bandage contact lens. So we need not put only one medium. We can cut it into 4 or 5 pieces and put in different media. So you catch the growth of bacteria, fungus, everything, and not just one medium. Now, this is a very important slide. The growth of organism on the solid media, if it is very confluent, like as shown in these pictures, you definitely, it is a very significant growth. It's important to see that the growth is on the sample wherever you have inoculated. Similarly, if there is growth in more than one medium, 2 media are showing. That's why we put more than one medium. We don't inoculate just one medium, just one slide. We have multiple things so that we can rule out contaminations. So if growth is in more than one medium, it is significant. Also, if you have seen in the smear, let's say you have seen fungus and it grows even in one medium, it is significant. In case of doubt, at least in corneal scrapings, we can always repeat a sample if there is growth only in one medium, and clinically you are not sure. So we may ask you to repeat, and one scraping properly probably can be repeated. Identification of bacteria and fungi is not the job of the ophthalmologist, but it's good to have some knowledge about that so that you can discuss with the microbiologists about the significance of what has grown. So we look at colony character, rate of growth, and nowadays, apart from biochemical reactions, we have systems. Samrat, may I ask whether you have been able to get Vitek?
No, madam. No, we don't have Vitek.
Yeah. So
There are some
that's
labs
another thing. Uh,
There's some labs in Raipur who have Vitek, but we don't have.
yeah, you can send, sometimes you can send your isolates to them to identify, because biochemical reactions are very, very limited scope of identification. So Vitek is a very good automated method. Nowadays, the company is really able to push this to many laboratories, and every city has many laboratories. I remember that 1992, 91, I joined the LVP. In 92, I was able to get the first product called API from the same company, Biomero. And I was the first one in Hyderabad, apart from Apollo Hospital, to have that API system. And from then, I've been a fan of this Biomero company. It's a French company, and it has evolved. The same API has evolved over the years, and now it is Vitek 2 compact machine, which is now available in many, many laboratories. It's a very good one with a database for a large number of bacteria and yeast. It doesn't identify fungal filaments, filamentary fungus, but yeast and almost all bacteria can be identified with very good accuracy and probability. Identification of fungus remains manual to a large extent. We look at the colony character, and then we look at that's why it takes time. Actually, saying that fungus requires 4 weeks of or 1 month or 2 months to identify, that is actually not true. The fungi, they start growing within 24 to 48 hours, because most of the organisms which cause ocular infections, the fungi which cause ocular infections, are like Fusarium and Aspergillus. They are fast growers. Within 24 to 48 hours, they start appearing. As you can see in this chocolate agar, they appear on the plate, but to be identifiable, it may take time. It's not that the growth itself. So we don't have to incubate a medium for 2 weeks. If it does, something doesn't grow within, doesn't start growing within 1 week, it's unlikely to grow. And more of contamination will happen to the plate if you keep it for a very long time, and not more than 2 weeks, definitely. These are some of the biochemical tests for identification of bacteria, different types of tests for gram positive, and these are for gram negative. All this is good to be aware, though you may not know how to do and may not remember which is positive for what. But awareness is important, and this is how the report of the Vitek comes out. It's a printout which shows you the confidence of identification, whether it is good, it is excellent, or whether it is unidentified. And you get the name of the organism with the probability. So it's a very good way of identifying bacteria. However, there are many which, especially fungus, we are unable to identify, and we go for what is called sequencing. So we isolate the DNA of the organism, the culture, and then we can do a PCR with this DNA and then send it for sequencing to companies. We can do ourselves, but for it's not necessary for you to have a sequencer. Every lab need not have it. Nowadays we have private labs which do the sequencing, so we just extract the DNA extraction kits are available, very easy to do. And then you just do the PCR, or the company will even do the PCR. Suppose you give them bacteria and you say that you want DNA sequencing to be done for identification, you just send them the DNA. They will do the PCR, they will do the sequencing. And this picture is to show you the sequencing results. Sequencing is nothing but ATCG, the 4 bases of DNA, It will just show what is the sequence of those bases. And normally the results they can send by email. You can just receive that, and then very simple methods are there. One can spend some time and learn how to just put it in the database and get the identification. Here is another thing. I don't know whether Raipur has, but in Hyderabad there are two laboratories which have this what is called MALDI-TOF.
No, ma'am.
This is
Raipur
based
doesn't
on
have MALDI-TOF yet.
MALDI-TOF is based on protein. It's different. Sequencing is based on DNA. This is based on proteins, and this also is a very good method. You after you isolate in the culture on the solid medium, a pure growth is taken, and they just add a little bit of, I think, formic acid or something like that, and then put it in the machine. And within few just I think within half an hour it has a protein profile in the database. Based on the protein profile, it gives which organism. Again, it is limited to bacteria and yeast. In Chandigarh, PGI Chandigarh, they are trying to actually one publication we have made. I have participated in that, where we sent the black fungi. Black fungi are called Dematiaceous fungi. So we sent large number of black fungi, and they have tried to build the protein profile of those black fungi. But the company has to take that profile and put it in the machine and validate it first, and then only it become available for general use. So right now we have just made one publication from some around more than 100 isolates of black fungi, but it's yet to become a part of the machine. Identification of yeast, I already mentioned. You can do by several methods. So it's very, very easy to do. So what I wanted to say is Acanthamoeba does not form colonies. It grows on non-nutrient agar with E. coli, and directly you have to keep the plate under the microscope and look for trophozoites and cysts. Cysts are easier to identify because they are round. The shape is very typical, and you can see very easily even under a very low magnification once you get used to it. So Acanthamoeba culture is very simple actually. Now you may also come across from the eye various types of parasites, like this is a Yeastridae, the housefly larva actually. It can be inside the eye or it can be on the conjunctiva, external surface also. Similarly, we have learned now to look at Demodex. Very, very simple to examine. Actually, a lot of things, the moment we recognize, it becomes very simple. And then every patient we can diagnose. Earlier, we were not knowing about that. They look very huge. They are actually, this is all in low power. They look so big. You in high power is not at all required to go to high power, and you can see once you recognize how they look, it becomes eyelash is taken in either in KOH or a glycerol we can take and examine under the microscope. No staining is required. Similarly, you can see lice, which is usually a pubic lice, Thyrus pubis, which is found on the eyelashes. These are the nits. You can see the live organism also, live lice under your slit lamp. So with this, I shift a little bit. Not much can be said about viral. It's a very big subject, but we try to do genes are stained to look at multinucleated giant cells and lymphocytes, which give a indication that it might be viral. Especially, I know that it's mostly clinical diagnosis, but wherever required, we try to do immunofluorescence assay because we have the fluorescence microscope and we can show the antigen of the virus. You can use the antibody for HSV or for adenovirus, whichever is available, and do immunofluorescence assay on the corneal scrapings. And of course, our mainstay of diagnosis in viral infection is PCR. We do the PCR. This is just a cartoon to show that you have 4 colors of bases that you add in the reaction that you do. And of course, it is the more of expertise is required. One has to learn it. And this is the kind of publications you will see images like this. This is a conventional PCR showing in the gel the these bands which are at a particular base pair, and this is it has a molecular marker, weight marker here, that these are the bases. These 100 base, 200, 300. This is a ladder, we call it base pair ladder. And then whatever sample you have, this one control has to be there, positive control, negative control, and then the patient sample. So this patient sample is positive and this patient sample is negative, and this positive control is also at the same size of base pair. So this needs much more of explaining, which will be beyond the scope of this presentation. But there are many modifications of PCR, and now we have settled for what is called real-time PCR. The difference between real-time PCR and normal conventional PCR is, in a normal PCR, whether you have 10 copies of DNA or you have 100 copies, the band that is seen is not very different. You can't really make out. Whereas in real-time PCR, the DNA is tagged with a fluorescent dye, which is called cyber green. And because of that, the amount of fluorescence emitted is proportional to the DNA that has been formed. And so you can see that copy number of DNA will be known by the amount of fluorescence that is emitted. So I think recently, because of COVID, RT-PCR testing, people have learned more about this real-time PCR. And I think people have also seen that lesser the cycle CT value, or which is actually cycle threshold, more of DNA. And so ICMR had directed the labs to actually give their report in terms of CT value. So lesser the CT value, more of DNA, because it will start amplifying quicker if there is more of DNA. So the CT value naturally will be lesser. So it's very simple to understand that. So we are having a real-time PCR machine also, and we do it for HSV, VZ, VCM. There are kits available, and it's not very difficult to do if you can get the machine. The setup required for all these things which I mentioned about molecular diagnosis may look huge, but we have not done everything at a time. It has been done slowly, one after the other, and now the lab is able to do all these tests that I mentioned. Sequencing, I would like to say something. When you get a report, as I mentioned, you send the DNA to a company, there are many companies. Bioserve is there in Hyderabad. You have companies in Bangalore, Ahmedabad, and of course Delhi and Mumbai, where you can get sequencing done, and by email they can send you. The report looks like this. You see a huge chain of G's, ATCG, which is just, this is the sequence, and just these 4 alphabets in a chain. So what is done is this whole set of alphabets is put in a website which is very close to PubMed. When you open PubMed, you can see that there will be one icon called GenBank, and it is nothing but the bank of sequences of all kinds of organisms in the world which scientists have identified. And when you feed this sequence into that particular website and say blast is another icon you have to press, you get a list of organisms to which that sequence is matching. And it shows you that the first one is human herpes virus 1. So your sequence, which you got from the DNA which you gave to the company, is matching with the human herpes virus. So it is that simple to identify based on sequence. So sequencing is no more domain of very big labs. Very small labs which can just extract DNA can also do sequencing. Based on this sequencing, so I had a PhD student who was actually working on microsporidia. His PhD was microsporidia, but I always get them to do some extra work. And the other work he was doing was unidentified fungus. He was doing this sequencing. And once you do sequencing, you can do what is called phylogenetic analysis. And here you see the blue ones Pythium insidiosum are all the isolates from LVP. B is from Bhubaneswar actually, and some are from Hyderabad. H is Hyderabad. They are very similar to, in the database, whatever Pythium insidiosum is there. And so by sequencing is the first thing which led us to recognize Pythium insidiosum among our cultures, which were unidentified. I didn't know what they are. They are all unidentified when there is no spores, and I cannot identify which fungus it is. It is fungus, that's all I know because of the filaments. And so then we caught this Pythium insidiosum by this method. So I have gone retrospectively and learned about the smears much later. First, I learned the sequence. And then we learned when we went back to the pictures. I keep pictures of every smear which is positive and every culture that is positive. So we went back from the sequencing. Retrospectively, we found out that this is how the filaments of Pythium look. And the culture is just a very flat growth on blood agar and chocolate agar. It can grow on SDA also, but we are using chloramphenicol in SDA to prevent contaminants. And because of that chloramphenicol, we are not getting growth on SDA. You will get growth if you don't add the chloramphenicol. And then we learned in histopathology also, just like zygomyces, it looks like aseptate, broad filaments. And then now we have published 2 or 3 papers where we have also described the clinical pictures of these. So we have gone retrospectively from sequencing, we have gone backwards to learn about the culture, and then backwards to learn about how it looks clinically. In the process, instead of wanting to do sequencing for every isolate that we get, we learned about zoospore formation. And you can see here, it is actually not a fungus, it is a oomycete. And these oomycetes have a propensity to form zoospores, so which becomes very handy to perform in the laboratory. And without doing sequencing, we can recognize that this is a Pythium. So we look for typical filaments in smears, typical culture, isolate the morphology of the culture, and then we do the zoospore. Though, of course, we are doing sequencing, we don't wait for sequencing to give the report. We give the report from the smear itself, suggestive of Pythium. Moment the culture grows, we are confirmed that it is Pythium. And moment we see zoospores, we are confirmed it is Pythium insidiosum. This PCR is very useful for endophthalmitis, especially fungal endophthalmitis. It's a similar PCR that is done for corneal scrapings. We don't do much for corneal, but we do for vitreous because the sensitivity of culture is very, very low in vitreous. Now I'll shift to the topic actually given to me was antibiotics testing. So before that, can I have some questions? If somebody has. And I can take my tea a little bit.
Good morning, ma'am. I'm Dr. Swapnil.
Morning.
I want to ask, when we do OT surveillance, we quite often get a report that one bacterial colony or 2 bacterial colony or 1 fungal colony. So how many colonies do you consider significant while we do OT surveillance?
So let me understand, you are putting plates in the OT, open plates. For how long do you open it?
Madam, this thing, as per our this thing, we are putting blood agar and this thing, blood agar plate, blood agar and chocolate agar for half hour, open plate
Half
and
yeah.
open plate method. And we have kept it at 10 colonies.
Yeah, then you close it and you keep it for incubation.
Yeah, and then our cutoff threshold is for 10 colonies per plate.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, that is what has been published. We also take it as 10 colonies.
Or 1 fungal colony, we consider it significant.
Fungus should be 0.
Yeah, so even if we get 1 fungal colony, we take it as significant.
Yes, correct.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. Thank you, sir.
Good morning, ma'am. This is Dr. Panchu here, ma'am, fellow vitreoretina. I want to ask for every case of endophthalmitis, are you sending samples for PCR, or is it just the culture based method, ma'am?
We do culture, and
Okay, ma'am.
every in-house, the patients who have developed endophthalmitis, they were after surgery in our hospital. So those patients, as a rule, we do PCR.
Okay, ma'am. And a small question, ma'am. This thing for inoculating from the vitreous sample, do you do that in OT itself, or can we send the sample to lab downstairs? Will that make a
You can send the syringe aseptically. Actually, I forgot to put that picture. Now we have made some silicone, the nozzle of the syringe. We remove the needle, and the nozzle of the hub of the syringe is covered with a small silicone tube, which is closed on one side. I forgot to put that picture here, but that's only because we also put up anaerobic culture. Otherwise, for aerobic culture with the needle itself, you can just wrap it in a sterile. Normally, the paper that comes out from the gloves, when you take out gloves, one sterile paper will be there, cover. So inside that they put it, or you can have bags for carrying samples also. Anything, it should be sterile, and send it to the laboratory immediately.
okay, ma'am.
If you are doing the surgery in the evening and the lab is closed, so then okay, so this is a list of antibiotics that we test in our laboratory. It's a panel. Mainly we take care that we have different classes of antibiotics. And the very common test is disc diffusion, which I'm sure you must be doing. But we also do what is called E-test for finding out the minimum inhibitory concentration. And the Vitek also can do what is called minimum inhibitory concentration. So we do both disc diffusion and MIC. And this is a picture to show how what MIC means. MIC is you have different concentrations of antibiotics in different tubes, and the minimum concentration of antibiotic which inhibits the growth is called MIC. And we have books which are called, you must be reading in publications, that CLSI guidelines. So what does that mean? Clinical and Laboratory Standards Institute is CLSI. And CLSI actually gives us the type of different zones that are required for determining whether something is susceptible, intermediate, or resistant. And without this book, we will not be able to say, or that's a guideline for determining susceptibility. And this is the way the book inside, you have different antibiotics on this side, and then you have zones for susceptible, intermediate, and resistant. With the scale, we measure the zone of diameter. And then referring to this table, we say whether it is susceptible or resistant. So that's the typical way of finding out whether something is susceptible or resistant. Now, here is a concept. Why is it relevant for therapy? You can look at this graph. Below minimum inhibitory concentration, if an antibiotic is given to a patient, at that time, the organisms will keep on multiplying in a normal way because there is a low drug concentration. And any multiplication will lead to formation of a mutation. Every 10 to the power 10 or 10 to the power 14 growth, the organism yields mutations. And after MIC levels, you have another zone of what is called selection window. So in this selection window, an organism which is susceptible will die, and the one which is resistant will survive. So actually the whole concentration of the antibiotic is promoting selection of resistant organisms. Only after another level, which is called mutation prevention concentration, a slightly higher concentration, is a time when all organisms will die. So this is a concept which is recently recognized by the pharmaceutical companies, that they must make drugs which should be safe At the same time, it will be preventing mutation and not give drugs only at the MIC level. I hope this concept is clear. And recently, 1.5% levofloxacin has come into the market, which is based on this concept. So this is what this, I will skip how to determine that. And you know that resistance is developing over the years, right? When 1940 penicillin was discovered, in 42 itself resistance had developed, and similarly for many other antibiotics. Developing resistance is a natural phenomenon for an organism. In any population of bacteria, you have one or two which would have mutated on their own and have the propensity to become resistant. And when you give antibiotics at the zone I showed you there, they get selected, and resistant will survive and all the susceptible would die. And after that, you will have only a population of resistant organisms. So that's a natural thing that happens. And by giving antibiotics, we only enhance that. Once a bacteria becomes resistant, it has different methods of transferring that resistance to other organisms, and they are called conjugation. You must have read that earlier. It's called transduction, which happens with the help of virus, and also it can be just transformation, a naked gene getting into the bacteria. So this is a publication you can look up in, I think it is in IJO, where Dr. Sujata Das and others have shown that in recent times, gram-positive infections are increasing, whereas gram-negative is slightly at a lower stage. But the organism called Streptococcus pneumoniae, which is very common in keratitis, also quite common in endophthalmitis, the resistance is very, very low. You can see 100, 99, 97% of the isolates remain susceptible to different antibiotics, both fluoroquinolones and other antibiotics. So this is an organism which is not very resistant, but it is very, very virulent. Whereas in contrast to that, Staphylococcus aureus resistance to ciprofloxacin is very high, 50 to 54% only are susceptible. But the only drugs they are remaining susceptible is cefazolin and vancomycin. Pseudomonas, on the other hand, the fluoroquinolones are still good. Only for moxifloxacin it is reducing, but 96, 89%. But the other aminoglycosides are no more good for Pseudomonas so much. This publication again shows the same thing. This is from LVP Hyderabad, British Journal of Ophthalmology. The Staphylococcus aureus and epidermidis, they are developing resistance, but not Streptococcus pneumoniae. Now, every country should be actually monitoring their antibiotic resistance levels. And one new study I would like you to refer to, Armour study in 2018, Penny Asbel, very beautiful study where whole of US, how nicely they have been actually monitoring for 2 decades ocular infections. So in India, we really don't have that kind of a setup to monitor antibiotic resistance among the isolates of different eye infections. But ICMR has made an effort, and now I think from other infections, there is an ICMR portal where, but that's only voluntary, and the method of testing is so diverse that you really worry about the type of results entered there. Whereas in Armour study, all the isolates from all over US were actually transported to one laboratory, and the method of testing was single, one method for all the isolates. So that's much more reliable data that you can get that way. So this is what I meant. ICMR surveillance is not very relevant for ocular isolates, but ASIC study, Asia Cornea Society Infectious Keratitis Study, initiated by Donald Tan and actually supported by many companies, has tried to do this across Asia. And LV Prasad and Arvind Eye Hospital were part of it. And we had many antibiotics that we tested. The organisms, again, top was Streptococcus pneumoniae and Pseudomonas aeruginosa gram negative. So I got my hands on Arvind Eye Hospital data and compared that with our data, which shows what I just said. Again, resistance more in Staphylococci, no resistance in Streptococcus pneumoniae. Pseudomonas was very, very different what was there in Arvind and in LVP. LVP, there is resistance to of Pseudomonas to many antibiotics, but not so much in Arvind. So it shows that probably geographical variation is there among the population, which is more community based or more hospital based. Hospital based are likely to have more of resistance. There is a good news anyway that you also as a clinicians must have noticed that even if the laboratory reports something as resistant, patient might respond. And this is actually has led to the formula 90-60 rule, that if an organism is susceptible in the laboratory, it will 90% of the time the patient will respond. But if it is resistance also, 60% of the time the patient may respond. So my teaching usually is if the patient is responding, no matter what the lab says, you must continue using the same antibiotic. NABH is very particular about antibiotic policy, but they have come out with this statement that many of the hospitals which are accredited to NABH have antibiotic policy on paper, but they are not compliant to the practice. A laboratory should come out of its own type of resistance data, and policy should be based on what your hospital is facing. But as NABH finds out that people may do all these things, but they don't really follow the antibiotic policy. The reasons for development of drug resistance, I think we all know, and we ophthalmologists try to blame the other doctors who give systemic antibiotics. But again, there are now reports that ophthalmologists themselves, by using topical antibiotics, especially as a prophylaxis, they are also increasing the resistance of the conjunctival bacteria, which are there as a normal flora. So with this, I thank you for your attention. If there is time for any questions, you can ask.
Recently, ma'am, in one of your publications, I think that's from Bhubaneswar, you all showed that, for ciprofloxacin or aminoglycoside resistant Pseudomonas, that is the multi-drug resistant, colistin, you are also reporting colistin resistance. I think that has come from your Bhubaneswar campus, because for multi-drug resistant keratitis, we have been using colistin. You all have showed that there was 50% resistance in colistin. So that is of concern.
Yeah, but I don't think it's that rampant because here, what I remember recently, there are, first of all, multi-drug resistance is not so common, not very common, but once in a way you may find, yeah. So when you find it, at that time, colistin remains effective. Most of the time.
Yeah, but in Bhubaneswar, you'll have reported, I think 50% of those isolates are even resistant to colistin.
I'm not sure.
Within a couple of weeks. Okay, okay.